Yeah, the sister taxon of the chelicerates are the mandibulates. And we learned a lot in the last 10-15 years about the phylogeny of the mandibulates, so it mixed up previous thoughts about the phylogenetic relationships quite a bit. Today we are quite confident that the basal group actually of the mandibulates are the myriapods. And we in fact found 3 species here of myriapods, only of one of the large groups of the myriapod, the diplopods. There's a number of groups in the diplopods, but they live rather in a uniform way as detritivorous animals. There's a rather basal group of the myriapods, and this is, we found one very characteristic species of basically all these limestone habitats in Germany, but the same actually applies to Europe. So you may also find this species in the Mediterranean. This is a agglomerate myriapod, Glomeris marginata. Easy to recognize, really very easy to recognize. It's black and it's having yellow margins of the tergites. These glomerates, in German called Saftkugler, they look a bit like isopods, but in fact, of course, they are totally different. They have these diplosomites, so 2 segments which are bound together basically and are bearing 2 pairs of legs. They're very interesting also from a biological perspective. They live quite long, probably 5 to 7 years or something. So they survive the winters, they move a bit deeper into the soil, and in spring they come up and actually they produce clutches of eggs. This is the individual eggs are enclosed into soil aggregate structures, and the female stays with that clutch of eggs for a while, probably only as long as it continues to lay eggs, and then later in the year they disappear again. Glomeris is also interesting because it's a true detritivore species. It feeds really on litter material, including beach litter, which is a very nasty resource containing very little nutrients and a lot of lignin, which cannot be digested. But Glomeris manages to make a living on it. Okay, another group of the myriapods we found 2 species from is the Ulid millipedes. These are slender, long species with a lot of segments typically. Characteristic, of course, also is this fusion of 2 segments and the 2 legs per diplosomite. In German they are also called Schnurfüßer because they are long like a line. We have one species which is fairly large actually and easy to recognize to species in the field because it's blackish or dark brown, the whole body, but the legs are white. And this is Tachypodoiulus niger. Yeah, I'll come a bit more to the biology with the next species, which actually is even a bit bigger and again very easy to recognize. This is Omatoiulus sabulosus. This is a species which is having 2 red or yellow bands along the dorsal side of the animal. An interesting thing, again similar to Glomeris, is that in this Omatoiulus and Tachypodoiulus they also grow quite old, probably up to 8 or 10 years. So again they have to survive the winter, even in the northern countries, here in Germany. And an interesting aspect there is that they actually can decide if there is a scarcity in resources in some years not to reproduce. And if this is the case, they do not express the genital structures. Basically, they rebuild in a way the genital structures, and this is then a typical form you may actually recognize in the males, and this is the so-called intercalary males. Another feature which is quite interesting in Omatoiulus is, in some years, in kind of good years, they may form huge populations, and in these years they may even migrate in the thousands. So in some years you may encounter these millipedes wandering basically around the landscape. This mainly occurs in more southern countries, so not that much in Germany, but also in Germany they can migrate quite some distance. Now we come closer to the most diverse terrestrial group, the insects. As we learned in the last 10-15 years, actually insects form part of what was formerly known crustaceans. So we now recognize crustaceans as being paraphyletic. And the crustaceans together, most of the former crustacean groups together with the insects, form one large phylogenetic group called pancrustaceans, Pancrustacea. From the kind of true crustaceans, we have two species we found here, which I will first now go into a little bit, and then we move to the insects, of course, the major diversity of the arthropods and the most of the species we've found here. Yeah. Terrestrial crustaceans are mainly the rather kind of true terrestrial crustaceans are mainly isopods. There's a number of transitions from water to land in crustaceans, but the kind of most advanced, of course, is in isopods. And I will start off with one species which we found here, which is of the family Phyllostiidae, and this is Phyllosia muscorum, the moosassel. A species which is kind of widespread in more moist places, but you may also find it actually under stones in rather dry places. You can recognize Phyllosia by one typical character which you kind of always have to look at if you want to determine isopods, and this is the antennae. The basically last bending and last part of the antennae in Phyllosia is having 3 segments. This is also the case in Oniscus azellus, but this looks quite different. Phyllosia is brownish with a bit more lighter longitudinal bands, so kind of easy to recognize in the field. So the second species is more typical for these dry habitats and rather typical for the rocky habitat we looked into here. This is a species of the family Cylisticidae, and this is Cylisticus convexus. A typical feature of some isopods is that they can form a ball. This is of course most typical in the what's called Rollassel, in the armadillid isopods, and this resembles very much to glomerids, the millipedes we looked into also here. But so Cylisticus is also able to form kind of a ball, but this ball is in a way incomplete, so they cannot integrate all the appendages into that ball. So basically they are just bending the former part of the body and hind part of the body together, and it is looks a bit more like an egg-like structure rather than a full round ball. And the antennae are looking out of that egg-like structure. And if you see that, actually, this is Cylisticus, and it's Cylisticus convexus. Another interesting thing what we have here is actually that Cylisticus is having kind of true tracheal systems. In isopods, many of the isopods, the terrestrial isopods, still rely on free water, and they have to keep their gills on the pleopods wet. There's different strategies how they do that. In some of the more derived groups, we do have these basically lungs on the pleopods, and they are called white bodies, weiße Körperchen. And you can see them by the naked eye. So of course with a lens it's always better, but you can also see it by the naked eye. So you turn them around, and from underneath you can identify also the number of these white bodies. Yeah, typical for dry habitats. We also would have certainly expected to find Armadillidium, but we found this species, which actually is more rare than Armadillidium. Okay, with this we come to the insects. Probably insects, as we learned, are a sister group of some crustacean lineages. This is still disputed as far as I know, but it's probably some basal lineages of the crustaceans which form the sister group of the insects. Well, insects, we can't go into the details, but I like just to stress that they made the transition to land from some enigmatic crustacean ancestor, and this transition to land occurred, of course, only once. So within the whole arthropods, we now have transitions to land in the chelicerates, independently in the myriapods. In the crustaceans we had the isopods, and now we have the insects. This transition to land certainly was the kind of most successful, because as we now know, we do have close to probably 1 million of insects. So the great majority of all described species are insects. The basal groups of insects now, they do not have wings, of course, and the initial lineages which went to land, of course, didn't have wings, despite the great majority of the insect species do have wings. Now, virtually all of the insects we found here, of course, are winged insects, the pterygote insects, but we have one group actually which is not winged, and this is a group which is characteristic to these rocky habitats which we have here. It's warm and rocky habitats, and this is the Archaeognates, Archaeognaten, or in German it's Felsenspringer. They resemble kind of very much the Zygentoma, the fischchen, which I assume more of you know, because they may occur in your bathroom. And superficially they look rather similar. So they are not winged, they are kind of long, there is no, the thorax and abdomen still are rather similar, and of course there is no wings on the thorax. So this is in both groups, in the Archaeognates and in the Zygentomans, kind of the same. In the Archaeognates there are some characteristic features, and related to the German name, Felsenspringer, they're able to jump. So they're elongated, and if you encounter them by turning around stones, you may quickly recognize they are vigorously jumping individuals, rather hard to catch actually. They are fairly big, easy to recognize just by the feature that they are jumping away. Other jumping basal insect groups are the springtails, but they do it very differently. So the Archaeognates actually jump by bending the whole body and then extending it and jumping kind of away quite a distance, some 10-20 centimeters, and they kind of disappear thereby quickly, so not easy to catch. Another easy to recognize feature is that they do have 3 appendages at the end of the abdomen. There's a few species in Central Europe. They are more widespread, as one may expect, in the Mediterranean, so warm regions. One of the most common one is Dilta, the genus Dilta, and the most common species is Dilta hibernica. And this is the species we found here. Okay, with this we come to the great diversity of the insects, and this is the pterygoid insects. Of the non-pterygoid insects, we had the archaeognates, and then I was mentioning the Zygentoma, and it's actually that the sister group of the pterygoid insects is the Zygentomans. Well, there's some delicate characters which we are unable to recognize in the field, but it's related to the mandibles, and the Zygentomans and the pterygoid insects do have similar mandibles. A brief word to the evolution of wings. This goes beyond, of course, what we can elaborate here in the field, but of course one may wonder, where do these wings come from? This is such an important evolutionary character, so it's basically, it allowed insects to fly. Also an interesting aspect is, by flying they may escape actually all the spiders hunting for them. But of course it simply allows to locate resources in a very wide range of area and habitats. And what is clear by now is actually that these wings originated from appendages which are part of the basically of the split legs, which are still present in crustaceans. So part of these split legs at the thorax developed into wings. And an interesting aspect you may recognize if you look into aquatic pterygoid insects with aquatic larvae, like the ephemeropterans, the mayflies. They do have respiratory organs on the abdomen, and these respiratory organs are actually lacking at the thorax. This is interesting because in the end, homologous structures to these respiratory organs develop into wings.
So hi, I'm Sonja, and I'm now introducing you into another group of insects. We are at the basis, so we leave now the apterygoid insects and go to the pterygoid insects, which are or were basically saprophagous in the beginning, all of these groups, and had biting mouth parts. And also the group that we look into now has biting mouth parts, but changed their diet to phytophagous. We will now look into a hemimetabolous group, which are the orthopterans. I guess you all know orthopterans, so grasshoppers and locusts and so on. And they all share a trait that they have this saddle-like pronotum, and they all have, usually some of them have a long ovipositor, and they're just quite peculiar, and I think you know the principal shape. And they all have jumping legs, grasshoppers, yeah. And there's 2 big groups within these orthopterans, the Ensifera and the Zählifera, so the Langfühlerschrecken Ensifera and Kurzfühlerschrecken Zählifera, and the name already tells you the main difference, so there's a lot, some morphological differences. First, the length of the antennae, so Caelifera have short antennae that are shorter than the body. Ensifera have long antennae that are longer or even much longer than the body length. And also there's some more differences. For example, the the way they produce sound. So the ensiferans do that by with their wings. So they have little thorns on one side of the wing and then rub it against the other wing, and by that they produce a sound. And compared to that in the Zellifera and the Kurzfühlerschrecken, it's these row of thorns is on the inner side of the hind femur, and they rub these hind femur against the wing to produce sound. And also the sound receiving organ is totally different location on the body. So in Ensifera you have this on the fore tibia, you have a slit or an oval-like tympanal organ, and in the Caelifera you have this organ also of peculiar shape on the first segment of the abdomen. And there's some more differences which I won't tell you all now, but yeah, they are quite peculiarly different. Maybe one more word to the ecology. So the Caelifera are all grass feeders, so they're typically typical inhabitants of these meadows where there's lots of grasses, and they feed on the grasses themselves or on the seeds. And the Ensifera, they prefer herbaceous plants, and some of them even are predators or have even a mixed diet with herbaceous plants and some small, rather soft insects that they feed on. Yeah, okay, so now let's look into these groups. We start with the Caelifera, Zellifera, Kurzfühlerschrecken, and we start with the genus Cortypus, a very common genus, and you can tell that you have the genus Cortypus by some rather easy to see traits. One of them is that you have the antennae are not clubbed or something, and you have the so-called Scheitelgrübchen, so you have little depressions on the forehead. And the most important trait actually to tell that you have a Cortypus is the so-called Präkostalfeld. So it's a little field in front of the first vein of the wing. So the costa is the first vein, the outer vein of the wing, and before that you have in Cortypus a little curved field. And this is the so-called Präkostalfeld, and when you see that around here, like in our fauna, you can be sure that you have the genus Cortypus. And when you then want to know which species of Cortypus you have, you look at the keels of the pronotum. So the pronotum is like this, and you have keels here, and they may be curved, they may be straight, or they may have a really strong edge. And by that you divide the Cortypus species even further, and then you also may have a look into the shape of these tympanal organs, so of the ears they have. And this may be oval, or it may be a bit more slit-like, so whatever. And so what we have here is one with this very strong edge in these pronotum edges, pronotum keels, and it's one of this Cortypus bigutulus group, which comprises 3 species, Cortypus bigutulus, bruneus and mollis, and they were only recognized as different species like maybe 100 years ago, and this was done by listening to their calls. So this is a thing that's quite interesting about orthopterans, that they sing, kind of. So they produce these sounds which give you the possibility to distinguish between species. And this was also the case in this bigutulus group, so they morphologically they look rather similar, and the traits that differentiate them, they are very variable in each of the species, so that can be really hard, especially in the males, to tell which species you have, although yeah, you can see all traits very well. So you can have the possibility to listen to them, to hear the song, and they are really very different. And this is also why we think we have Cortipus bigutulus here, because this is the only Cortipus we heard when we went over these meadows. And also it's the most common of these three. And you can also, well, you find it on almost every meadow. And the sound is like, well, some people say it's like a Kinderrassel, like a child's rattle or something like that. But probably everyone has to has to make their own, yeah, thoughts of how it sounds to them to recognize it actually. But it's easy to recognize in the field, and very, very abundant sound on these meadows. Okay, so then we look into the next species of the Cellifera, and this one is from the genus Stenobotrus. Stenobotrus does not have these precostalfeld as like Cortipus has, but instead it has another very peculiar trait in the wing venation, which is the so-called erweitertes Medialfeld, which means that you have a vein, the media, and under the vein there is the Medialfeld. You don't really have to know which vein it is. You only have to look into the at the wing and see if two of these horizontal veins are a little bit further apart from each other, and at the same time have very parallel vertical veins. This is quite easy to see in the wing when you have it in front of you. And the most common of these is the species Stenobotrus lineatus, and this is also the one we have here. In English it's also called stripe-winged grasshopper, because the females usually have a white stripe on the wing. The males usually don't. The wings are dark and also always have a white stigma. So yeah. And this is a very characteristic species of these nutrient-poor meadows like we have here. You can hear the sound everywhere when you go on such a nutrient-poor meadow. And the sound is also very peculiar, I think. It's a buzzing sound that goes up and down like bzzz, and it makes this with his two different legs. Yeah. Yeah, this is Stenobotrus, very characteristic for this habitat. Okay, and then we go to another family within the Cellifera, and this is a very interesting family, the Tetragidae, the pygmy grasshoppers. And they're called pygmy grasshoppers because usually they're quite small. And you can easily recognize this family by a trait that the pronotum is elongated above the whole length of the body. In German they're also called Dornschrecken because, yeah, people describe this elongated pronotum as some kind of thorn. And this pronotum covers the wings and the whole body, and in some species also it can also be much longer than the body itself. Yeah, the forewings are reduced to little scale-like wings, and the hind wings may be long. Some species even may fly. And they're also a little bit special within the Cellifera because they overwinter as juveniles or adults. So when you go on one of these meadows in early summer or in spring, you won't find any adult grasshoppers or locusts because most of them hatch in early summer from the egg, and then they go through their juvenile stages, and they are only adult in maybe mid of June, and then later in the summer, of course, in great masses. But in the Tetragidae, you can already find adult individuals in spring and early summer. And what's also kind of special is their feeding habit. They mainly feed on mosses and lichens. That's also quite special within the orthopterans. Yeah, and also they are an exception in many ways. They also don't stridulate, so they don't make a sound, and nobody knows of any tympanal organ or something they have, so probably they also don't have any ear. They find their mates probably just visually. Yeah, and the species we have here is Tetrix bipunctata. The Tetrigida, the different species, it's not many, I think it's around 6 or something, are quite tricky to determine two species, but we think it's Tetrix bipunctata because it has a very quite broad hind femur, and it also has these 2 dots that are in the name, but this is not exclusive for bipunctata. Also other Tetrix species might have these 2 dots, so yeah, you cannot rely on that. And also it's very typical for this kind of habitats, so these stony, nutrient-poor meadows, that's a very typical habitat for Tetrix bipunctata, so fits quite well. Okay, so then let's move on to the Ensifera, so the Langfühlerschrecken. And the first species I want to show you, it's very common, the genus Tetigonia. So also das grüne Heupferd belongs here. There's 2 species that may occur around here. One, when they're adult, it's quite easy to distinguish them. So one has very long wings that are much longer than the hind knee, and the other one has shorter wings that only reach until the hind knee. The one we have here is a juvenile, so it has typical juvenile wings, so you cannot tell for sure which species it is, but probably it's Tetigonia viridissima because it's just much more common than the other species, Tetigonia cantans. Tetigonia is interesting because, well, it's quite large, and it is mainly, at least in the adult ones, mainly predators. So they don't really feed on herbaceous plants anymore, but rather on soft-bodied invertebrates. They also have thorns on their forearms with which they catch these little invertebrates. Yeah, and they have a sword-like ovipositor. It's very long, and also you can already see it in this juvenile individual. So it's a female with this long ovipositor, and yeah, Tetigonia is responsible for these typical summer night sounds, I would say. So when you sit outside in the summer and it's already dark, you still can hear this typical Tetigonia sound, which makes a summer night like we all know it, I would say. Yeah, maybe you remember, or you will hear it now. Or maybe in a few weeks, because many of them are not adult yet. Okay, so this is Tetigonia. Then we have one more species of Ensiferan, and this is from the genus Phaneroptera. This is a different family than the Tetigonia family. They usually, in this family, most have short wings, so very short wings, and cannot fly anymore. And they also don't have these sword-like ovipositors, but rather a sickle-like, so it's bended very much and usually very broad. And then it has some thorns with which you also can identify them. And but Phaneroptera is an exception in the way that this species has long wings, and also very peculiar long wings, because the hind wings are much longer than the forewings, which you don't see in any other orthopterans, I think. So it's easy to identify. Well, but we here have a larvae. So I'm quite sure that it's a larvae of Phaneroptera falcata, a species that usually occurs further south from here. But on this quite warm and exposed dry meadows, it might well be that they also occur here. They usually need some kind of shrub or forest edge. They like to sit in the shrubs and not like on the plain grass in the grassland. But this fits quite well for this place where we are now. They are like light green and yeah, and the song is, yeah, I think I don't hear it. It's very high frequency, but you can detect it with a bed detector. And this is true for many of this family of the Phaneroptera, that they have these high frequency sounds they make. And if you really want to do a survey on orthopterans, you also have to take your bed detector with you to include also them. And it's also a special species because it's the only one that lays eggs into leaves. So not as many others into the stems of plants or into the soil, but into leaves. Yeah. Phaneroptera falcata, so yeah. Okay, so now we've finished the orthopterans with some literature advice. This book, Die Heuschrecken Deutschlands und Nordtirols, is on the market since maybe 2 or 3 years by various authors, and it's a recommendation because it's kind of the best field guide I've ever seen. Maybe also kind of easy group the orthopterans to make such a good guide, but it's really perfect. So it's with photographs, and on each photograph you see like details and arrows pointing to all the important characters, and there's also a very nice introduction about all characters that are important in orthopterans, quite a lot about their ecology, and there's lists with checklists for red list, of course, and in which habitat which species occurs. So yeah, I would really recommend, if you're interested in orthopterans, buy this book, because there won't be a better book. Yeah.
Okay, the next group will be Heteroptera, in German die Wanzen. In English they are often called the true bugs. And we are still inside hemimetabolous insects, so we have no apomorphic trait for them because hemimetabola are paraphyletic. So, and for the Heteroptera we are in the group of Rhynchota, and the Rhynchotia, they have this special trait that they have sucking mouth parts, and the members of Rhynchota are mainly the cycads and the Heteroptera, the true bugs. And cycads are mainly phytophagous in Heteroptera, and the true bugs you have predators and phytophagous taxa, and actually also have parasites like the bedbug. Okay, now we are in the bugs really, and they also have some traits. So the most important trait is the one where the name is coming from, Heteroptera. So that means that the wing is not homogeneous, but it has the corium is sclerotized, and the membrane is really thin, so you can look through it. So that's the main character of the Heteroptera. And there's one other trait, they are called stink bugs often, so they have a gland for stinking, for defense basically. Okay, to start somewhere within or inside the Heteroptera, we start with 2 predatory taxa. The first one is Reduviide, so it's a predatory Heteroptera. They are not very abundant actually, so only in very warm and sunny places. Usually they are more in the south of Germany, and this one is called Rhinocorus annulatus. You see that the legs are red and black, And the connexivum, which is area around the hind part of the bug, is also black and red. So this is the main character, especially for this species. So, and they are really rare, and obviously from the name you know already that they are predatory as predatory bugs. So one of the rarest ones we have. Okay, and another predatory taxon are the Narbidae, in contrast to the Redoviidae, which have a very strong, short mouth parts, and which are usually not really attached to the body, but they are a little bit lifted from the body, and they are, well, a little bit round. And the same is true for the Narbiidae. They're also predatory, but the mouth parts are much thinner here. So, but you can easily recognize these two groups. They're the only two groups where the mouth parts are not connected with the body. And in Narbidae we found one species, and this is Himacerus myrmicoides. And from the name you can actually hear already has something to do with ants. And this one is a juvenile, and the juveniles, they pretty much look like ants. The adults look like normal Narbidae, but the juveniles, they look like an ant, so it's some kind of mimicry. And since all Narbidae are predatory, these ones are also predatory ones. Okay. Well, next group, a really large group so means lots of species, are Miridae. In German they are called Weichwanzen or Blindwanzen, and this is actually already giving us some hints on the characters. So they don't have any ocelli. They can still look because they have normal eyes, but the ocelli are actually missing. This is one of the main traits, and additionally they have in the wings, they have a field which is called the cuneus. It's a triangular field. Usually it's also colored, you can easily see it. And sometimes in the membrane they have one or two separate fields. So there's actually no way to confuse the Miridae with any other group, but they're really, it's lots of species, and often it's difficult to go to species levels. Okay, there's one which is not so abundant. It's called Calocoris roseomaculatus. It's also phytophagous and has special character. It has red stripes along the body, so it's very easy to separate from all the other Miridae. So sometimes Miridae are easy to determine, but yeah, often not. But in this case it was possible. And then another one, also very abundant, another Miridae. It's Capsus arta. It's, as you can hear from the name already, arta is often black, so it's completely black, but it's only the male which is completely black. The female is a little bit black and red, and the antennae are in the beginning thin and then thicker, and in the end thin again. So you can't confuse it with any other Miridae as well. Very typical, completely black. Also phytophagous, feeding on grasses. But you know, as I told you in the beginning, some bugs are also predatory, in contrast to the cycads, which are all phytophagous. So it's another Miridae. It's black, and the cuneus is red actually, so you can easily separate it from others. And it's Deorocoris ruba. You see ruba again from the name, it has red dots, and it's another Miridae, and this one is predatory actually. And the last Miridae is Leptopterna dolobrata. It's also very abundant. It looks a little bit like Stenodema, but it has a different color, so it's yellow, red and black. And it's also phytophagous, feeding on grasses, and it basically also occurs everywhere. So this is not really a rare one. Okay, so we are coming to the next group. It's Rhopalidae. And Rhopalidae are an exception in the true bugs, because the whole wing is actually, you can look through the whole wing, so it's like, looks like the membrane. So this is where the name Rhopalidae, Glasflügelwanzen in German, is coming from. And it's actually, it doesn't have the typical character of the bugs, because well, it doesn't have the typical wing, but it has a typical, it looks like a typical bug actually. So you wouldn't confuse with anything else. Well, maybe the easier one is Coryzos hyoscyami. a Rhopalide which is black and red. So you could confuse it with a Lygeide, but when you look more closely, you see that the wings are so typical. It's also a phytophagous species. And another Rhopalide which is mainly brown, so not so easy to go on species level, but there are not that many species in Rhopalide anyway. So it's Rhopalus parum punctatus, and it's mainly brown and has the wings on top where you can see through. So yeah, it's a bit more difficult than Coryzus to go on species level with that one. Okay, next taxon are the Alydide. In German they're called Krummflügelwanzen because the antennae are a bit curved, but not very much actually. But it's very few species. Actually, it's mainly Alydus calcaratus. It's the most frequent species. It's completely black, but when it's lifting the wings, it's orange. So the body is actually orange. It has very long antennae, and it also is a phytophagous species. Okay, the last group of the true bugs are the Pentatomide. The name is coming from the antennae, and the antennae have 5 segments, and this is where the name Pentatomide is coming from. So, and this is a very frequent one, easy to recognize. It's Dolichorus baccharum. In German it's called the Bärenwanze, and they have very long setae, so you can't confuse it with any other Pentatomide. It's also phytophagous, feeding on many different plant species. And it's actually switching color, so in the beginning it's more red, and it can have different colors throughout the year. And in Pentatomide there are lots of large taxa included. Another typical Pentatomide is Graphosoma. Actually now it's called Italicum. It was always called Graphosoma lineatum. It's completely red and has long black stripes. But now it's renamed because of molecular analysis. Well, I don't want to go in detail here. Actually now we have to remember the name Graphosoma italicum. And there's no species looking similar to this one. So you can also, when you have a red bug with black stripes, you can't confuse with any other one. It's also a phytophagous species. Yeah, another Pentatomide where it's difficult to go to species level actually is Sciochoris. It has a brown color and a large scutellum, so you can easily see it's this group Sciochoris. But then going on species level is a bit more difficult, so we just leave it with the genus Sciochoris. And it's feeding on grains of grasses. One, let's say, untypical Pentatomide is Aelia acuminata. It's sometimes called, in German it's called the Getreidespitzling. The name is coming from, because it's feeding on grasses, so it's also a phytophagous species, and has an untypical habitus for the Pentatomide, because it's very slender and yeah, it's not as broad as all the other Pentatomide. Usually it's green-brown, has some white stripes, not really white, let's say light brown stripes, and you can also not confuse it basically with any other Pentatomide. It's very abundant but has untypical shape for Pentatomide. Okay, and then there's one group within Pentatomide, it's called Scutellaridae. They also look like the Pentatomide, but the scutellum is really, really large, so and covering actually most of the body. And we found one species, it's called Eurygaster maura. So it's really large and brown. It's also a phytophagous species, and also, yeah, also difficult to confuse with any other one. Yeah, and the last one is also in the group of Pentatomide, but yeah, it's also not completely typical, let's say. So it's very much colored, so it's green and red, In German it's called Buntrock. This is where the name is coming from all these colors. And actually it has a spine on the ventral side coming from the back to the head. I don't know if this one has any function, not that I know of. And it's called Zyphostetus tristriatus. And also because of the colors, well, as I said already, you can't confuse it with any other Pentatomida. And they are called Acanthosomatide within Pentatomida because of this long spine, which has no function as far as I know. Okay, these were the true bugs. Okay, if you're interested in the true bugs, there's one very, very nice and recent book, Die Wanzen Deutschlands. It's really very nice. It has pictures of all the true bugs. They're nicely described. It said what they're feeding on, how they reproduce and where they're living. And this is really, really a nice book for the true bugs.
We already heard one group or went through one group of the Rhynchota, so the insects with sucking mouth parts, which had this wing sclerotized and membrane with a membrane structure. So it's the heteropterans. There's a second large group in the group of Rhynchota, and this is the homopterans. There is a number of lineages in the homopterans, aphids for example, which we will not deal with. We only want to go into a little bit into one group of the homopterans, and these are the cicada, or also called actually Orcanorhyncha. So their sucking mouth part goes down straight from the head into the plant. So they are all plant sucking species. The cicada fall into two large groups, so-called Fulguromorpha and Cicadomorpha, and we actually have two species here of each of these groups. The Fulguromorpha are somewhat less species rich, but there is one family in the Fulguromorpha which is by far the most species rich, and this is the Delphasids. The Delphasids are characterized by a spur-like structure at the hind tibia. You definitely need a lens to see that. If you watch with a lens and look at the hind legs, you may identify this spur-like structure, which probably helps for jumping away. In addition, you may recognize the Fulguromorpha in general by the antennae. The antennae have basal segments which are rather stout. So this applies to all of them, also to the Delphasids, and they often have also keel-like structures on the fronts and on the head, basically. All are plant sucking, but the peculiar thing also is that the Delphasids are more on sedges and rushes, not that much on grasses. So they also are very widespread in more wet places. But of course there is also rushes on the dry grasslands. So we also find species of Delphasids there. But they may also be rather generalistic in the plants they feed on. And this actually applies to the species we found here, which is the genus Aziraca clavicornis. And this is a species you can't misidentify. If you see it, you just know this is something very specific, and you just have to look for an appropriate picture, and then you know, okay, this is Aziraca. Well, the really very characteristic thing is that these stout basal segments of the antennae are flattened and really big, very big, like kind of horns looking into the front. And then also the front legs, the tibia and femur of the front leg is also flattened. So this is an extremely characteristic species. It's basically widespread, but in a way rare. So you don't encounter it often. So it's always kind of highlight if you find it. So now coming to the second species or group I like to introduce, and this is among the cicadomorpha. So this other, basically, large second group of the cicada, and it's kind of similar to the fulguromorpha. There's one family which dominates the whole group in terms of species, and this is the cicadelids, the small cicada, Kleinzikaden in German. And again, they can be easily recognized as a family because the hind tibia is having a row of thorns along the tibia, and this again, in part, you may even see that in the larger species by eye, but typically you need a lens and can actually see that rather easily. Yeah, this is, as said, a very speciose group, several hundred species, and most of them are difficult to identify. So for a typical field excursion, one doesn't go to the species if you're not really a specialist. So, and this also applies to this species here. It may well be the genus Turutus, but we're not sure. Yeah, in the end, cicada, actually this is a very interesting group of species, and well, it's not that long ago that it was really difficult for a field ecologist to go into that group. But this changed with the publication of some very nice field guides, and the one I would really recommend is this one, Mühletaler, Holzinger, Nickel-Wachmann, Die Zikaden Deutschlands, Österreichs und der Schweiz. This is a wonderful, nice book which allows you to determine a large number of species really in the field.